We didn't time that. So, Kody, I've written you a couple of emails. I'm glad you. Oh, sorry, Kody. I'm glad you mentioned our Canada's ethical and moral responsibility, to the rest of the world, and that's kind of what I want to talk to you about tonight. Since October 7th, Israel has been indiscriminately bombing the civilian population in Gaza. 15 judges that the International Court of Judges have ruled there's a plausible case for genocide. Kody, when I wrote you emails about this, you gave me a call one day. Unfortunately, I was in the mall and I'm old, so I deleted the message rather than getting to listen to it. But I listened to the first little bit, and I was a bit kind of taken aback that you seemed a bit upset with me probably also. So, Kody, I went and looked at the federal lobbying records. I'm a researcher. That's kind of what I do. And I came across a receipt for a trip for close to $24,000. Yep. That you were sent on a trip to Tel Aviv and possibly other places by the Center for International and Jewish Affairs, which is a lobby group, which has been rather aggressively pushing out misinformation. Kody, I'm not here to really give you a hard time. I know it feels like that, maybe. Kody, I'm going to ask you, in the current context, you may not have known as much when you took that trip as you do now. Yeah. And we all have maybe had some time to maybe reflect about the actions we've taken. I want to ask you, Kody, given what you know now, see, I appreciate much what you had to say tonight. I'd like to support you, but some things are a bridge too far. Given what you know now, would you still go on that trip? And if you wouldn't, would you commit tonight to paying back that money and freeing yourself up so that you can speak clearly on this matter? Thank you.
Yeah, so for the benefit of everyone, for years there have been, there's what's called private travel, private sponsored travel. So there'll be organizations in many different contexts where they will encourage members of parliament and they will help support the costs associated with going on trips. Taiwan has been an example, Rob, where there's been a number of trips that have been sponsored in that. We just had colleagues that were actually sponsored by Muslim associations to go to the West Bank to particularly investigate what's going on now. CIJA has traditionally supported a lot of different trips. When I was approached to go on the trip, I said yes, in part because I personally, I wouldn't have had the money to go to that region by myself, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity to go, and I had never been to that region. So your simple answer is yes, I would go again, because it was very enlightening for a number of things. We didn't just go to Tel Aviv. We went to the West Bank. We spent time in Ramallah. We had the chance to sit down with Canada's head of mission to the Palestinian territories. We had the chance to sit down with Arab-Israeli members of the Knesset and to be able to talk about their issues. We were in Ramallah talking to Palestinians about their feeling on how we get towards a two-state solution. And so the idea that somehow this trip has cast a shadow, I mean, we're sitting here, you're able to ask this question in public. Sure. It's fully on the public register. I think it's actually, I would go back and do it again. I want to talk a little bit about the conflict because I think it's important. I want to talk to you a little bit about the advocacy I have been doing inside our caucus and the conversations that I've had. But for me, what was really enlightening being in Israel and seeing how divisive the Netanyahu government was. Had I never gone on that trip, I don't think I would have ever been able to contextualize and feel that on the ground. We were in Tel Aviv in July. There was like over 100,000 people protesting the Netanyahu government. Before I ever went to the region, I would have presumed that Israel was kind of a homogeneous type of society, that it was kind of like, no, very different in terms of the approach, very different in terms of how religious and fundamental parties within Israel have a lot of control under their proportional representation system. And was able to see how many everyday Israelis were frustrated with the Netanyahu government. we talk about the October 7th attack. I was literally in the area where that happened. So I count myself actually extremely fortunate that I had the chance to go and have some context that allowed me to have an appreciation. Being in Ramallah, talking to our Canadian head of mission, and it was not, you have to go on these trips not saying that you're gonna quote unquote to drink the Kool-Aid. I had a Muslim colleague from Calgary, George Shahal from Calgary Skyview. He's been a very ardent and very public, even at the start in terms of his frustration with the Netanyahu government. He went on that same trip. We had different members of parliament from different parties. So I count myself very lucky. It's all in the public record. Part of what is being discussed right now in Ottawa is actually, there is no ability for members of parliament to travel internationally under the operating budget that we have. I can go to any provincial capital in this country, but I can't go internationally. There is points to New York and Washington. There's a contemplation of actually changing that, and it sounds as though, Rob, that would be something you would welcome, so that members of parliament that want to see different parts of the world or different geopolitical dynamics are able to do that funded by government or through the House of Commons, not through private travel. I actually would really relish that opportunity, because then I would have been able to go and facilitate a trip that would have been able to have been paid for by the House of Commons and not through a private party. So to answer your question, no, I would have done it again because it was one of the most enlightening experiences that I had. In terms of the conflict, I put one position paper out back on November 19th in terms of my letter to Melanie Joly. The conflict has evolved over time as well. This was a heinous, terrible attack by Hamas, and it can never be condoned, and I will never condone it. The proportionate response, which has not been proportionate, has been equally terrifying and terrible for innocent civilians in Gaza. I have been appalled to see the way in which the Netanyahu government has talked about reoccupying Gaza. Terrible stuff. And part of what our work has been inside the caucus is a couple things. You mentioned the International Criminal Court of Justice. Our government has been very clear that we support its jurisdiction and its ruling. It's a prima facie case at this point, so if you were to ask me on genocide, I'm not in the place to say that. That's for the court to decide, but we respect its ruling. On arms embargo, which has been coming across my office as well, I actually specifically, particularly for last night's town hall, I wanted to make sure I had the information. When I talk to Global Affairs Canada, there is no lethal weapons coming from Canada directly to Israel to support its war against Hamas, and of course I know your position would be the concern about the civilian impact. But there can be indirectly types of equipment that could be assembled in another country and sent. And so I know that that is a preoccupying concern for many people, and I think it's something the government is looking at and addressing. There is equipment that's sent from Canada that is not of its nature, but one of the examples that was given to me is maybe a scope is exported from Canada to Israel. The scope itself may not cause harm to residents, but it could be used by the Israeli military. How do we find that balance? I mean, those are things that the government's going to continue to look at. UNRWA and the funding of UNRWA has been a big conversation piece. And again, the allegations that are being levied are quite serious to the people that are being identified as potentially involved. And I'm not in a position to say up or down if that's the case. I had a conversation with Minister Hussein last week, actually. Minister Hussein, for the benefit of this room, is the Minister for International Development. He was in Jordan, and he was actually at the Rafah Gate, and he said, you would see rockets being shot towards Israel, and you would see airplanes dropping bombs right in the middle of where civilian areas are. So it's a terrible situation all around. Canada has committed, on the UNRWA piece, there's a lot of focus that Canada has cut funding from UNRWA. There's no Canadian funding right now. The way that the installation payments work is that Canada had already sent its requisite funding to UNRWA that will last till April, is my understanding. If we do not renew the funding by April, then there would be a pause in the funding that Canada provides to that organization. Again, the allegations are serious. It's a large organization, I believe, in the tune of about 25 to 30,000 people, and we have to find a way to continue to support Gaza. Canada is the largest contributor towards the humanitarian efforts in Gaza per capita of any country in the world. And I am, the minister has said, particularly on airdrops, that is going to be a focus. And then last piece is this two-state solution. I mean, that has been Canada's position all along. That has not changed. And we have been calling for a ceasefire. I know early on people wanted to see a ceasefire right away. There are still hostages that are held, we believe, by Hamas. I have seen, like you have in the news, the idea that there is a hope that between Arab countries, the United States, Israel, and Hamas, there can be some type of brokered ceasefire, which of course, we want hostages to be returned and we want to be able to find a peaceful outcome from this. So I know that's a long way of taking the time to try to respond to you. I'm happy to have a further follow-up if you'd like after this. Again, the experience itself, the fact that it's on the public record, the fact that you can come to a town hall and ask me about it, I don't regret it because I think it was really enlightening and it was an important piece for me to have a deeper context for the region that I otherwise would have never had a feel for.
I mean, thank you, Kody. I appreciate your explanation, and I'm not going to hijack the whole meeting on this subject. My disappointment, you know, I grew up on the same streets as you did in this community. You know, I'm also a blue-collar guy, and that trip was $24,000 over 8 days, and I don't understand how you're spending nearly $3,000 a day on a trip from an influential Israeli lobby, how you're getting to see how Palestinians live, and how you're getting to see how Palestinians live under that occupation. I just don't understand how you went on that trip and spent that amount of money and then got any kind of perspective, you know, especially because the people who send you on that trip, you know, they have an agenda, you know, and they...
And Rob, as I said in my remarks...
Hold on, I'm just going to finish this up. After the conflict started, I was looking eagerly for public statements from you, and all I saw was you criticizing protesters, and you writing letters to Melanie Joly asking that there be no ceasefire. When it was apparent, you made it apparent in your letter. You stated in your own letter to her that you knew that there was a humanitarian disaster, and you still refused to ask for a ceasefire. So I want to know, Kody, if I gave you $24,000 and then you refused to ask for a ceasefire, is that a quid pro quo? I mean, you can see how it looks. So that's why I'm asking you to pay back the money. It's not for my sake, it's for yours.
Sure. So the trip, it was my spouse and myself. Members of Parliament were entitled. There was others that did that. It's all on the public record. It's there. I have the letter to Minister Joly. I'm happy to share this with the group. I see you're recording the entire response here today. I've been very clear that in the midst of how this conflict has evolved, I wanted to see, there was a lot of language around ceasefire versus humanitarian pause. The feeling from many, we don't have a large Jewish population in Kings Hans, there are some families, and I've had conversations with them, and this has been a very difficult conversation within the own Liberal caucus.
I mean, I don't
Rob, if I could,
Rob, between East Hans and Israel, like, is there some trade deal between Palestine and Israel that we don't know about? Like, why are you involved?
Rob,
That's what I don't get.
I listened to your question respectfully. I'd ask that you listen to my response. Sure. Part of my job as a member of Parliament is to listen to my constituents. There are Jewish members here that have a different view about the dynamic that happens on the Middle East. That's a reality. There might be people in this room that have a different dynamic about what is happening and how that's playing out. As a member of Parliament, I have to try to sort through that. I have to be able to try to advocate. I've told you the work that I've done with our Muslim caucus in trying to make sure that Canada continues to provide the aid. Canada has been very clear in calling for a ceasefire. In the time that I wrote the letter to Minister Joly, I made very clear that I supported the work to stop the conflict, conditional on Hamas surrendering, and to be able to actually release the hostages. So I don't want my words to be misconstrued. I have copies of the letter. I'll make sure that they're there. But yeah, it's a terrible situation that's happening right now. And I know many people feel helpless in terms of how they contribute, how they can help. Part of my work as a member of Parliament has been to try to work with our cabinet ministers who have portfolios that can touch on this conflict and to try to find an ability for Canada to help diplomatically resolve what's happening right now. Because it is a terrible situation. We have condemned the Israeli government's statements, particularly on the resettlement, the further settlements in the West Bank, and the fact that we think that they have been indiscriminate, to your point. So it's out there on the public record. I'm glad that I went on the trip. I'm glad I had the opportunity to be there. Members of Parliament are entitled to take that. You're entitled to ask questions and hold me to account in the public forum. And I'll let my constituents and I'll let the Canadian public decide in terms of what it is. And there would be a long list of individuals who have taken that trip. In terms of both all parties and many members of parliament that have gone, I believe Mr. Singh with the NDP has also gone on that trip. Look, there is a long list because I've looked at it before. And I'm happy in the fact that I think we're actually going to have a mechanism for members of parliament moving forward that private travel will not be an element, and we won't be forced to choose, would I like to be able to go learn more about an actual requisite situation. You talked about the cost, Rob. You talked about the cost. A flight to Tel Aviv, a flight and the hotels and the travel and the transportation, it's an expensive trip to be able to go. I wouldn't have been able to have that opportunity otherwise. I want to be able to move on. If you want to talk about this after, happy to do so, okay? Okay.